The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed centuries of royal drama, but nothing quite like this. When the sophisticated alarm system pierced the morning silence at the Royal Lodge, it wasn't foreign intruders or common criminals that triggered the security breach. It was Prince Harry, once fifth in line to the throne, now standing outside the gates of what was once his second home, desperately trying to gain entry to see his father during what many believed could be King Charles's final days. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that morning. The same man who had walked these grounds as a child, who had played in these gardens, and called this place home, was now being treated as a potential threat. The security cameras captured it all: Harry's frustrated gestures, his attempts to reason with the guards through the intercom, and the moment when desperation overtook protocol as he tried to climb the perimeter fence. This wasn't just another family disagreement. This was the culmination of years of bitter feuds, public accusations, and a rift so deep that a son couldn't even visit his dying father without setting off every alarm in the royal security system. What had brought the spare heir to this desperate moment? And why were the very people who once protected him now keeping him away from the family he was born into? The morning that would change everything had begun like any other, but it would end with questions that would shake the very foundation of the modern monarchy. The morning mist still clung to the manicured lawns of the Royal Lodge when Prince Harry's unmarked sedan approached the familiar gates. It was barely 7 in the morning, and the Duke of Sussex had driven through the night from his temporary accommodation in London, his mind racing with the urgent phone call he had received just hours earlier. His father's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and despite the years of bitter silence between them, Harry knew this might be his last chance to make peace. The Royal Lodge, nestled in the heart of Windsor Great Park, had always been more than just another royal residence. It was where Harry had spent countless weekends as a child, where he had learned to ride horses in the private stables, and where some of his happiest memories with his mother, Princess Diana, had been created. The 30-room mansion, with its distinctive pink walls and sprawling gardens, had served as a sanctuary for the royal family for decades. Now, as Harry sat in his car staring at the imposing gates, it felt more like a fortress designed to keep him out. The security protocols at royal residences had been significantly upgraded following various incidents over the years, and the Royal Lodge was no exception. Motion sensors, thermal imaging cameras, and a sophisticated alarm system protected every inch of the perimeter. The protection officers on duty that morning were among the most experienced in the Royal Protection Unit, men who had served the monarchy faithfully for years and understood the delicate balance between security and family dynamics. Harry had not announced his visit. In the past, such spontaneity would have been normal, even expected. Royal family members had always enjoyed a certain freedom of movement between residences, protected by their status and the unwavering loyalty of their security teams. But things had changed dramatically since Harry's departure from royal duties and his subsequent public revelations about life within the monarchy. The trust that had once existed had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and carefully managed access. As Harry approached the main entrance, the first thing he noticed was the absence of familiar faces among the security personnel. The officers who had once known him since childhood, who had taught him about cars and football during long summer afternoons, were nowhere to be seen. Instead, he was met by younger guards who regarded him with the professional politeness reserved for any member of the public seeking access to royal property. The lead protection officer, Inspector James Morrison, had been briefed about the complicated family dynamics surrounding Prince Harry's potential visits. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Command, a man who had protected everyone from heads of state to high-profile witnesses. He understood that his primary responsibility was to the security of the residence and its current occupants, regardless of historical relationships or family ties. Harry lowered his window as Inspector Morrison approached the vehicle. The conversation that followed would later be described by witnesses as cordial but firm. Harry explained that he needed to see his father urgently, that he had received word about King Charles's condition and had driven through the night to be here. Morrison's response was professional but unwavering. No arrangements had been made for Prince Harry's visit, and current security protocols required advance notice and authorization from the King's private secretary. The rejection hit Harry harder than he had expected. For a man who had once commanded respect and instant access throughout the royal estates, being turned away at the gates of what had once been his home felt like a profound betrayal. He tried to explain the urgency of the situation, mentioning the phone call from a palace insider who had warned him that time was running short. But Morrison's hands were tied by protocols that had been established precisely to prevent unauthorized access, even by family members. Harry's frustration began to mount as the minutes ticked by. He could see the royal lodge in the distance, its familiar pink walls visible through the morning haze. He knew that his father was inside, possibly alone except for medical staff and a small security detail. The thought that bureaucratic red tape and damaged relationships were preventing what might be their final conversation filled him with a desperation he had rarely experienced. The conversation at the gate began to attract attention from other security personnel. Additional protection officers emerged from the gatehouse, their presence creating an increasingly tense atmosphere. Harry found himself surrounded by men in dark suits and earpieces, their body language suggesting they were prepared for any escalation. The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present, a prince of the realm being treated as a potential security threat at the home where he had grown up. Harry made several phone calls from his car, trying to reach anyone who might be able to authorize his entry. He called his father's private secretary, the palace switchboard, and even attempted to contact his brother William, though that call went straight to voicemail. Each unsuccessful attempt only heightened his sense of urgency and isolation. The barriers that had been erected around his family seemed insurmountable, even in what might be a moment of final reckoning. As the standoff continued, Harry noticed movement at the lodge itself. Staff members were visible in the distance, and he thought he caught a glimpse of medical personnel entering through a side entrance. The sight only reinforced his belief that his father's condition was serious and that his presence was needed urgently. The irony of the situation became increasingly apparent. He had spent years trying to distance himself from the constraints and protocols of royal life, only to find himself desperate to break through those very barriers when it mattered most. Inspector Morrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He had clear protocols to follow, but he also understood the human drama unfolding before him. The sight of a son trying to reach his potentially dying father was not something any decent person could ignore entirely. Yet his training and professional responsibility demanded that he maintain security standards regardless of the emotional circumstances. The tension reached a breaking point when Harry stepped out of his car, clearly preparing to make a more direct appeal for entry. Morrison and his team immediately moved to a higher state of alertness, their training kicking in as they assessed the potential for an escalating situation. Harry's body language suggested frustration and desperation rather than aggression, but the security protocols made no distinction between different types of unauthorized behavior. Harry walked to the gates themselves, gripping the iron bars as he stared toward the lodge. For several minutes, he stood there silently, perhaps reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The boy who had once run freely through these grounds, who had been welcomed and protected by everyone in sight, was now on the outside looking in. The transformation was complete, from insider to outsider, from protected to potential threat. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Harry knew that his window of opportunity was closing. If his father's condition was as serious as he had been told, every minute of delay could be crucial. The bureaucratic machinery that had once served to protect and support him was now the primary obstacle to what might be his final chance to reconcile with the man who had given him life, but with whom he had shared such a complicated relationship. As Harry stood at the gates, weighing his options, the security cameras captured every moment of his internal struggle. The footage would later be analyzed by security experts and palace officials, but in that moment, it simply documented a son's desperate attempt to reach his father before it was too late. The decision he was about to make would trigger alarms, mobilize security teams, and create a crisis that would reverberate through the royal family for months to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of family loyalty, institutional protocol, and the very nature of what it meant to be royal in the modern age. Harry's next move would determine whether this morning would end in reunion or further estrangement. The decision came to Harry in a moment of pure instinct. Years of military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and act decisively when necessary. Standing at the gates of the Royal Lodge, watching precious minutes slip away while his father potentially lay dying inside, Harry made a choice that would alter the trajectory of royal family relationships forever. Without warning, he began to climb the perimeter fence. The first alarm triggered immediately. A shrill electronic wail pierced the morning air as motion sensors detected unauthorized movement along the secure perimeter. Inspector Morrison and his team sprang into action, their professional demeanor shifting instantly to high alert. This was no longer a family matter being handled with diplomatic courtesy. This was a security breach of a royal residence, and their training demanded they respond accordingly. Harry was halfway up the 8-foot fence when additional alarms began sounding. The sophisticated security system at the Royal Lodge was designed to detect and deter any unauthorized entry, and it was performing exactly as intended. Thermal imaging cameras tracked his movement, while pressure sensors in the fence itself registered the unexpected load. Within seconds, the central monitoring station at Windsor Castle was receiving alerts, and backup security teams were being dispatched. As Harry dropped down on the other side of the fence, he found himself in the formal gardens he had known since childhood. The neat hedgerows and carefully maintained flower beds looked exactly as he remembered, but his perspective had changed entirely. He was no longer a welcome guest. He was an intruder, and every step he took deeper into the grounds was being tracked by multiple surveillance systems. Inspector Morrison was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating the response while maintaining visual contact with Harry's location. The protocols for dealing with perimeter breaches were clear and well-rehearsed, but the fact that the intruder was a member of the royal family created unprecedented complications. Morrison had to balance immediate security concerns with the potential diplomatic and family ramifications of any action taken against Prince Harry. Harry began running toward the lodge, his feet following paths he had traversed thousands of times as a child. The muscle memory was still there, guiding him past the ornamental pond where he had fed ducks with his grandmother, around the rose garden where Diana had taught him about flowers, and up the gentle slope toward the main house. But, with each step, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Additional protection officers were emerging from strategic positions around the grounds. The Royal Lodge's security was designed with multiple layers of defense, and Harry was now encountering the second line of protection. These officers had been monitoring the situation from concealed positions, and they moved to intercept him with professional efficiency. Their earpieces crackled with updates and instructions as they coordinated their approach. The sight that greeted Harry as he approached the lodge was both familiar and alien. The pink-washed walls and Georgian windows were exactly as he remembered, but the building now seemed to pulse with security activity. Additional personnel were visible at key positions, and he could see curtains being drawn in several windows as staff moved to secure the interior. Harry's appearance triggered yet another wave of alarms as he approached the main entrance. Proximity sensors detected his presence, while facial recognition systems confirmed his identity and immediately flagged the security concerned to monitoring stations throughout the Royal Protection Network. The technology that had been installed to protect the royal family was now being used to track and potentially apprehend one of its own members. Inspector Morrison's voice echoed across the grounds as he called for Harry to stop. The tone was authoritative but not aggressive, reflecting the delicate balance Morrison had to maintain. He was dealing with a prince of the realm, but also with someone who had just committed a serious security breach. The protocols demanded that Harry be stopped and detained, but the potential consequences of using force against a royal family member were enormous. Harry paused at the main entrance, his hand reaching for the familiar door handle. For a moment, he hesitated, perhaps realizing the magnitude of what he was doing. The house that had once welcomed him with open arms was now effectively a fortress, and his presence was being treated as a hostile intrusion. The childhood memories that had driven him to this desperate act seemed to mock him as he stood there, surrounded by security personnel who saw him only as a threat. The sound of approaching vehicles indicated that backup security teams were arriving. Through the morning mist, Harry could see additional police cars and unmarked security vehicles racing up the private road toward the lodge. The response was proportional to the perceived threat level, and a security breach at a royal residence involving an unauthorized individual always demanded maximum resources. Harry tried the door handle, but it was locked. The electronic security systems had automatically engaged the moment the perimeter breach was detected, sealing the building against potential intrusion. Even if he had somehow evaded the human security presence, the technological barriers would have prevented his entry. The lodge had become an impenetrable fortress, designed to keep him out even more effectively than it kept others away. As the security cordon tightened around him, Harry made one final desperate attempt to communicate his intentions. He called out toward the house, shouting his father's name and explaining that he needed to see him urgently. His voice carried across the grounds, but there was no response from within the lodge. The thick walls and security protocols ensured that his words reached no one who could authorize his entry or even acknowledge his presence. Inspector Morrison approached with his team, their movements careful and professional. They had been trained to handle high-stress situations involving public figures, and they understood that every action they took would be scrutinized later. Morrison's voice was calm but firm as he instructed Harry to move away from the building and comply with security directions. The realization that his desperate gambit had failed hit Harry with devastating force. He had risked everything on this moment, had thrown away any remaining diplomatic channels in favor of direct action, and it had accomplished nothing. He was no closer to seeing his father than he had been at the gates, but he had now created a crisis that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Additional alarms continued to sound as backup systems detected the ongoing security situation. The Royal Lodge's monitoring systems were designed to maintain alert status until the threat was completely neutralized, and Harry's continued presence on the grounds kept every sensor and camera focused on the unfolding drama. The technology that had been installed to protect was now documenting every moment of a family crisis. Harry's military background told him that resistance would be futile and potentially dangerous. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating on hostile territory with no tactical advantages. More importantly, any escalation could result in serious injury to security personnel who were simply doing their jobs. The last thing he wanted was for innocent people to be hurt because of his desperate attempt to reach his father. As he slowly raised his hands in a gesture of compliance, Harry caught a glimpse of movement in one of the lodge's upper windows. For just a moment, he thought he saw a figure watching the unfolding scene, but the distance and morning light made it impossible to identify who it might have been. The possibility that his father was aware of the drama taking place outside added another layer of anguish to an already devastating situation. Inspector Morrison's team moved to secure Harry, their actions professional but respectful of his status. They understood that they were dealing with a member of the royal family, albeit one who had just committed a serious security breach. The protocols for such situations had been developed precisely because of the unique challenges posed when royal family members themselves became security concerns. The sound of approaching helicopters indicated that the incident was being escalated to the highest levels of the security apparatus. News helicopters were undoubtedly en route as well, alerted by emergency service scanners and the unusual level of activity around the Royal Lodge. What had begun as a private family matter was rapidly becoming a public spectacle that would dominate headlines around the world. As Harry was escorted away from the lodge, he took one final look at the building that had shaped so much of his childhood. The pink walls seemed to glow in the morning sun, exactly as they had during countless happy memories from decades past. But now those walls represented barriers rather than welcome, separation rather than belonging. The transformation was complete. The prodigal son had become the unwanted intruder. The security teams began the process of securing the perimeter and conducting a full assessment of the breach. Every aspect of Harry's entry would be analyzed, from the initial fence climbing to his approach to the main building. The incident would trigger a comprehensive review of royal security protocols and potentially lead to significant changes in how family members' access to royal properties was managed. Inspector Morrison found himself facing the most challenging situation of his career. He had successfully prevented unauthorized entry to a royal residence, but he had also just arrested a prince of the realm. The paperwork alone would be unprecedented, and the political ramifications were impossible to predict. The incident would require careful handling at the highest levels of government and the royal household. As the immediate crisis subsided, the larger implications began to emerge. Harry's desperate attempt to reach his father had failed spectacularly, but it had also exposed the depth of the rift within the royal family. The sight of a prince being detained by security at what had once been his home would become a powerful symbol of how far the family had fractured. The morning that had begun with hope for reconciliation was ending with deeper division than ever before. The alarms that had sounded at the Royal Lodge had awakened more than just the security teams. They had alerted the world to a crisis that went to the very heart of the modern monarchy. The holding room at Thames Valley Police Headquarters was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings Harry had known throughout his life. He sat on a simple plastic chair, still wearing the casual clothes he had thrown on in his desperate rush to reach the Royal Lodge. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now being processed through the same criminal justice system he had once been taught to respect and support as a future leader of the nation. Inspector Morrison stood outside the interview room, engaged in heated phone conversations with various officials. The chain of command in a situation involving a royal family member was complex and unprecedented. Calls were being made to the Home Secretary, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the King's private secretary, and various other officials whose job it was to manage such extraordinary circumstances. Everyone wanted guidance, but no one wanted to take responsibility for the final decision about how to proceed. Harry's solicitor, a distinguished man named Richard Pemberton who had handled sensitive matters for the royal family for decades, had arrived within an hour of the arrest. Pemberton had received the call with disbelief, initially assuming it was some kind of elaborate hoax. The idea that Prince Harry would be arrested for attempting to enter royal property seemed so absurd that it took several confirmations before Pemberton accepted the reality of the situation. The media response had been immediate and overwhelming. News of Harry's arrest had broken on social media within minutes of the incident, leaked by someone with access to police communications. Within hours, the Royal Lodge was surrounded by news crews, photographers, and curious members of the public who had driven from London to witness the unprecedented spectacle. The story was already dominating international headlines, with news organizations struggling to verify the extraordinary details. Inside the lodge, King Charles remained largely unaware of the drama that had unfolded outside his window. His medical team had sedated him earlier that morning as his condition had worsened, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. The cruel irony was that Harry's desperate attempt to reach his father had occurred during one of the periods when the king was least able to receive visitors or even understand what was happening around him. Prince William had been contacted immediately after Harry's arrest, and his response had been swift and decisive. Rather than rushing to his brother's aid, William had instead coordinated with palace officials to ensure that the incident was handled with maximum discretion. His primary concern was protecting the monarchy's reputation and ensuring that his father could receive medical care without the distraction of family drama. The rift between the brothers, which had been years in the making, was now complete. The legal complexities of Harry's situation were unprecedented. While he had clearly committed trespass and triggered multiple security breaches, the unique circumstances of his royal status created a maze of legal and constitutional questions. Could a prince be prosecuted for attempting to enter royal property? What were the implications for the monarchy if a member of the royal family was convicted of a criminal offense? These questions had never been tested in modern British law. Harry's mental state during those first hours of detention fluctuated between rage and despair. The failure of his mission weighed heavily on him, but more devastating was the realization of how completely he had been shut out from his own family. The security measures that had prevented his entry weren't just about protocol. They represented a deliberate decision by his family to exclude him even in the most critical moments. Public opinion was sharply divided. Social media platforms were flooded with debates about Harry's actions, with some viewing him as a desperate son trying to reach his dying father, while others saw his behavior as reckless and entitled. The incident had reopened old wounds about Harry's departure from royal duties and his subsequent public criticism of the family. Polling data showed that the British public was almost evenly split on whether they sympathized with Harry's actions or condemned them. The international implications were significant as well. Harry's arrest was front-page news around the world, with foreign media focusing on the breakdown of what had once been considered the world's most stable royal family. Diplomatic sources reported concerns from Commonwealth nations about the stability of the monarchy and the potential impact on constitutional arrangements that depended on royal authority. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations were taking place about how to resolve the crisis. Palace officials were in constant communication with government representatives, trying to find a way to minimize the damage to the monarchy's reputation. The possibility of charges being dropped in exchange for a public apology was discussed, but Harry's legal team made it clear that their client was not prepared to admit wrongdoing for trying to see his dying father. The medical bulletins about King Charles's condition added urgency to the situation. Palace physicians were reporting that the king's health was declining rapidly, and there were growing concerns that he might not survive more than a few days. The possibility that Harry might remain in custody while his father died created a public relations nightmare that no one wanted to contemplate. Inspector Morrison found himself at the center of an international media storm. His professional handling of the security breach was being praised by law enforcement colleagues, but he was also facing criticism for not showing more flexibility given the family circumstances. The inspector maintained that he had followed proper protocols, but privately he struggled with the human cost of his actions. Harry's detention conditions were managed with extreme sensitivity to his status. While technically under arrest, he was being held in comfortable accommodations and allowed regular consultation with his legal team. The police understood that any mistreatment of a royal family member would create additional complications in an already delicate situation. Nevertheless, the basic reality remained. He was in custody and unable to reach his father. The Archbishop of Canterbury attempted to mediate the crisis, making private appeals to both sides of the family conflict. His Grace understood that the monarchy's spiritual authority was being undermined by the public spectacle of family dysfunction. Religious leaders from other denominations also offered their services, recognizing that the crisis had implications beyond just the royal family. Meanwhile, at the Royal Lodge, the medical team was preparing for what appeared to be King Charles's final hours. The sedation that had been necessary to manage his pain meant that he remained largely unconscious, unaware of the chaos surrounding his son's arrest. The physicians faced difficult decisions about whether to reduce his medication to allow for potential final conversations with family members. Harry's frustration with the legal process was mounting. Every hour that passed in custody was an hour he couldn't spend at his father's bedside. His solicitor was working around the clock to negotiate some form of supervised release that would allow Harry to visit the king, but the security establishment was resistant to any arrangement that might appear to reward his unauthorized behavior. The international press coverage was becoming increasingly critical of the royal family's handling of the crisis. Editorial writers questioned whether the monarchy could survive such public dysfunction, and Republican movements in various Commonwealth nations began citing the incident as evidence that the royal system was fundamentally broken. The soft power that the British monarchy had traditionally wielded internationally was being seriously damaged. Public demonstrations began appearing outside police headquarters, with both supporters and critics of Harry gathering to make their voices heard. The crowds remained largely peaceful, but the visible division in public opinion added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. Police resources that were normally dedicated to protecting royal family members were now being used to manage protests about royal family members. Harry's isolation in custody gave him time to reflect on the chain of events that had led to this moment. The decisions he had made in recent years, from leaving royal duties to his public criticisms of the family, had all contributed to his current predicament. But he also recognized that the family's response to his desperate attempt to reconcile had revealed the true depth of their rejection of him. The legal precedents being set by Harry's case would have lasting implications for the monarchy. Questions about royal immunity, the relationship between royal status and criminal law, and the extent to which royal family members could be held accountable for their actions were all being tested in real time. Constitutional scholars were already debating the long-term consequences of the incident. As night fell, Harry remained in custody while his father lay dying just miles away. The security systems that had been designed to protect the royal family had instead created an insurmountable barrier between a son and his father in their final hours. The tragedy was complete. Technology and protocol had triumphed over human compassion, leaving both men isolated in their darkest moments. The crisis showed no signs of resolution, and the clock was ticking toward what many believed would be the end of an era. King Charles's reign, which had begun with such promise, appeared destined to end with his family fractured beyond repair and his younger son locked away while struggling to reach him. The monarchy faced its greatest challenge in generations, with no clear path forward and the world watching every development. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning, when Dr. Margaret Thornton, the king's personal physician, made a direct call to the Home Secretary. The king had briefly regained consciousness and, in a moment of clarity, had asked specifically for Harry. Despite the sedation and his deteriorating condition, King Charles had somehow become aware of the crisis surrounding his son's arrest and was demanding to see him immediately. Dr. Thornton's call changed everything. The physician's professional assessment was that the king had perhaps hours, possibly less, before his condition would make any meaningful interaction impossible. Her medical opinion carried enormous weight, and she made it clear that denying a dying patient's request to see his son could be considered a violation of medical ethics, regardless of the political or security implications. The Home Secretary, Margaret Richardson, found herself facing an impossible decision. On one hand, she had clear legal obligations to uphold the rule of law and ensure that criminal justice procedures were followed properly. On the other hand, she was being asked to potentially prevent a final reconciliation between a dying king and his son. The constitutional implications of either choice were staggering. Emergency meetings were convened throughout the early hours of the morning. The Prime Minister was awakened and briefed on the situation, as were senior members of the royal household, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and various legal advisors. The decision that emerged from these consultations would set precedents that would affect the monarchy for generations to come. Harry's solicitor, Richard Pemberton, received the call at 4:30 a.m. The authorities were prepared to offer an unprecedented arrangement. Harry would be released into the custody of royal protection officers and escorted to the royal lodge under strict supervision. He would be allowed a brief visit with his father, but would remain technically under arrest throughout the process. Any attempt to escape or violate the terms of the arrangement would result in immediate return to custody and formal prosecution. The terms were harsh, but Harry accepted them without hesitation. The opportunity to see his father, even under such constrained circumstances, was more than he had dared hope for just hours earlier. As he was prepared for transport to the royal lodge, Harry understood that this might be his final chance to address the years of silence and misunderstanding that had poisoned his relationship with his father. The convoy that transported Harry from police custody to the royal lodge was unlike anything in royal protocol history. Flanked by police vehicles and followed by royal protection units, Harry traveled the short distance in an armored car typically reserved for transporting high-risk prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that a prince was being delivered to a royal residence under the same security arrangements used for terror suspects. The media presence around the royal lodge had grown throughout the night, with international news crews maintaining vigil despite the early hour. The sight of the police convoy arriving created a frenzy of activity, with photographers using telephoto lenses to capture any glimpse of Harry during the transfer. The images would become iconic. A prince in the back of a police vehicle, approaching his childhood home under arrest. Dr. Thornton met the convoy at a side entrance to the lodge, her expression grave as she briefed Harry on his father's condition. The king was conscious but weak, she explained, and the medications necessary to manage his pain meant that his awareness would fade in and out. There might be only a brief window for meaningful conversation, and Harry needed to be prepared for the possibility that his father might not fully recognize him or remember their interaction afterward. The royal protection officers who escorted Harry through the lodge were professionals who had served the family for years. Some had known Harry since childhood, and the complexity of their emotions was visible in their faces. They were fulfilling their duty to maintain security, but they were also facilitating what they understood might be a final farewell between father and son. The human cost of the family's breakdown was evident in their uncomfortable silence. The king's bedroom had been converted into a makeshift medical suite, with monitoring equipment and for drips creating a stark contrast to the elegant furnishings that Harry remembered from childhood visits. King Charles lay propped up in bed, his breathing labored, and his face drawn with pain and exhaustion. Despite his condition, his eyes showed recognition when Harry entered the room, accompanied by his police escort. The conversation that followed was witnessed by Dr. Thornton and the senior protection officer, both of whom were required to remain present as conditions of Harry's supervised release. What they heard would never be formally reported, but those present later described it as one of the most emotionally devastating encounters they had ever witnessed. Years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding poured out in whispered exchanges between the dying king and his estranged son. King Charles spoke first, his voice barely audible as he expressed regret for the circumstances that had led to Harry's arrest. The king's awareness of the security breach and its consequences suggested that he had been more cognizant of events than anyone had realized. His apology for the actions of the security team was both moving and startling, indicating that he took personal responsibility for his son's treatment. Harry's response was equally emotional, as he attempted to compress years of unspoken feelings into what might be their final conversation. He spoke of his love for his father, his regret over their estrangement, and his desperate desire to find a way forward for their relationship. The formal constraints of his supervised visit made the conversation even more poignant, as every word carried the weight of finality. The medical monitors in the room began showing signs that the king's condition was deteriorating as the emotional stress of the conversation took its toll. Dr. Thornton stepped forward to suggest that the visit needed to conclude, but King Charles waved her away with a gesture that showed his determination to continue despite his physical distress. The dying monarch understood that this was likely his last opportunity to attempt a reconciliation with his younger son. As their conversation continued, Harry found himself studying his father's face, trying to memorize every detail for what might be his final memory of the man who had given him life, but with whom he had shared such a complicated relationship. The king's resemblance to Harry's grandfather, Prince Philip, was more pronounced in illness, and Harry was struck by the continuity of royal features that connected generations of the family despite their personal conflicts. The king's energy began to fade as the medications necessary to manage his pain took hold. His words became less coherent, and his periods of alertness grew shorter. Dr. Thornton indicated that the visit would need to end soon, as the king's medical needs were becoming more urgent. Harry faced the terrible realization that their reconciliation would remain forever incomplete. In his final moments of clarity during the visit, King Charles reached out to take Harry's hand. The gesture was simple but profound, representing a bridge across years of silence and misunderstanding. The physical connection between father and son, maintained under the watchful eyes of police officers and medical personnel, became a symbol of the human cost of their family's dysfunction. The king's last coherent words to Harry were a whispered request for forgiveness, both for his own failures as a father and for the system that had led to such an extraordinary situation. Harry's response was equally quiet, but those present reported that he assured his father of his love and his own desire for forgiveness. The exchange represented a partial healing of wounds that had seemed irreparable just hours earlier. As King Charles slipped back into sedated sleep, Harry was escorted from the room by his police guards. The visit had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it had provided both men with a sense of closure that had seemed impossible given the circumstances of Harry's arrest. The supervised farewell had achieved something that years of diplomatic efforts had failed to accomplish. The return journey to police custody was subdued, with Harry processing the emotional weight of what he had just experienced. The protection officers who escorted him understood the significance of what they had witnessed, and their professional demeanor softened slightly as they recognized the human drama they had facilitated. The arrest that had begun as a security crisis had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. News of Harry's supervised visit to his father leaked within hours, creating another wave of international media coverage. The image of a prince saying farewell to his dying father while under arrest captured global attention and sympathy. Public opinion, which had been divided about Harry's actions, began to shift toward a more sympathetic view of his desperate attempt to reach his father. The The legal implications of the supervised visit remained complex and unprecedented. Harry was still technically under arrest, and the charges against him had not been dropped. However, the public relations impact of allowing the father-son meeting had changed the dynamics of the case significantly. Prosecutors faced the challenge of pursuing charges against someone who had been publicly seen as a grieving son rather than a security threat. King Charles died peacefully 3 days later, with Harry still in a form of supervised custody that allowed him to attend his father's deathbed. The final reconciliation that had begun during their supervised visit continued in the king's last hours, providing both men with a sense of peace that had eluded them for years. The monarchy's transition to a new reign began with the image of a family that had found a way to overcome even the most extraordinary barriers to forgiveness. The incident at the Royal Lodge would be remembered as a watershed moment in the history of the modern monarchy, demonstrating both the institution's vulnerabilities and its capacity for human redemption in even the most extreme circumstances. The death of King Charles III marked the end of an era, but it also began one of the most complex royal transitions in British history. Prince William's accession to the throne as King William V was overshadowed by the unprecedented circumstances of his brother's arrest and the public reconciliation that had followed. The new king faced immediate challenges that went far beyond the traditional ceremonial aspects of succession. The legal case against Harry remained unresolved at the time of his father's death, creating a constitutional crisis that had no historical precedent. The Crown Prosecution Service found itself in the extraordinary position of deciding whether to pursue charges against the brother of the new monarch for attempting to visit the previous monarch. Legal scholars debated whether the charges should automatically be dropped due to changed circumstances, or whether the rule of law demanded that Harry face the consequences of his actions regardless of the tragic outcome. Harry's legal team, led by Richard Pemberton, argued that the charges should be dismissed on the grounds that their client's actions had been motivated by legitimate family concerns, and that the subsequent reconciliation with his father had vindicated his intentions. They contended that prosecuting a grieving son for attempting to reach his dying father would be contrary to natural justice and would set a dangerous precedent for the relationship between the monarchy and the criminal justice system. The new King William faced intense pressure from multiple directions regarding his brother's situation. Palace advisors counseled that showing leniency toward Harry might undermine royal authority and suggest that family members were above the law. However, public opinion polls showed that a majority of British citizens believed Harry should not face prosecution, viewing his actions as those of a desperate son rather than a genuine security threat. International diplomatic pressure also played a role in the decision-making process. Commonwealth nations expressed concern that prosecuting Harry might damage the monarchy's reputation globally and affect constitutional arrangements that relied on royal authority. Foreign governments, particularly those with strong ties to Britain, quietly suggested that the family should resolve their differences privately rather than through the criminal justice system. The media coverage of King Charles's funeral became another flashpoint in the ongoing crisis. Harry's attendance at the ceremony, while still technically under a form of custody, created extraordinary security challenges and public fascination. The image of the late king's younger son attending his father's funeral under police supervision became one of the defining images of the royal transition. During the funeral proceedings, Harry's demeanor was closely watched by observers seeking signs of his emotional state and his relationship with the rest of the family. His interaction with King William during the ceremony was minimal but civil, suggesting that the brothers' relationship remained strained despite their shared grief. The Queen Consort, Camilla, notably avoided any direct interaction with Harry, maintaining the distance that had characterized their relationship for years. The Archbishop of Canterbury's funeral sermon included subtle references to forgiveness and reconciliation that many interpreted as commentary on the royal family's internal conflicts. His Grace spoke about the importance of family unity in times of grief and the Christian duty to forgive those who seek redemption. The religious dimension of the crisis added another layer of complexity to the legal and constitutional questions surrounding Harry's case. Public demonstrations outside Westminster Abbey during the funeral reflected the divided opinion about Harry's situation. Supporters carried signs calling for his complete exoneration, while critics argued that royal status should not exempt anyone from facing legal consequences. The peaceful nature of the protests reflected the British public's respect for the solemnity of the occasion, but the underlying tensions were clearly visible. 3 weeks after the funeral, the Crown Prosecution Service announced its decision. The charges against Harry would be dropped in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to respect royal security protocols in the future. The decision was carefully crafted to maintain the principle that security breaches had consequences while recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated Harry's actions. Harry's public statement accepting the terms was measured and dignified, expressing regret for any disruption his actions had caused while maintaining that his motivation had been love for his father rather than any intent to harm royal security. He thanked the police officers who had handled his case professionally and acknowledged the difficult position his actions had created for everyone involved. The resolution of the legal case opened the door for broader discussions about Harry's relationship with the royal family and his potential role in the new reign. King William faced pressure to extend an olive branch to his brother, but palace sources indicated that significant trust building would be necessary before any formal reconciliation could take place. The wounds inflicted by years of public conflict could not be healed overnight. Behind the scenes, negotiations began about how Harry might gradually rebuild relationships with family members. Queen Catherine emerged as a potential mediator, having maintained cordial relationships with both brothers despite their conflicts. Her position as the new queen consort gave her significant influence, and her diplomatic skills were seen as crucial to any successful family reconciliation. The international media continued to follow every development in the royal family dynamics, with particular attention paid to any signs of thaw in the relationship between the brothers. Royal watchers analyzed every public interaction, searching for clues about the private conversations that were taking place away from cameras and microphones. The global fascination with the family drama showed no signs of diminishing. Harry's children became another factor in the reconciliation discussions. King William understood that his niece and nephew deserved to have relationships with their extended family, regardless of the conflicts between their parents and the royal institution. The desire to maintain family connections for the next generation created additional motivation for finding a path forward. The security review triggered by Harry's breach of the Royal Lodge resulted in significant changes to royal protection protocols. New procedures were implemented to handle situations involving family members who might seek unauthorized access to royal properties. The review acknowledged that traditional security measures had not adequately considered the possibility of family-related security incidents. Inspector Morrison, who had handled Harry's initial arrest, was quietly transferred to other duties as part of the broader reorganization of royal protection. While his professional conduct had been exemplary, his association with the controversial incident made his continued service in royal protection difficult. Morrison later spoke privately about the personal toll of being caught between his professional obligations and his understanding of the human drama he had witnessed. 6 months after his father's death, Harry made his first official public appearance alongside other royal family members at a memorial service for military veterans. The carefully choreographed event allowed for limited interaction between Harry and his relatives while maintaining appropriate protocol. Observers noted that while the relationships remained formal, the hostility that had characterized recent years appeared to have diminished. The long-term implications of the Royal Lodge incident continued to unfold throughout King William's early reign. Constitutional scholars debated whether new laws were needed to clarify the relationship between royal status and criminal liability, while security experts called for clearer protocols regarding family access to royal properties. The incident had exposed gaps in both legal frameworks and security procedures that required careful attention. Public opinion about Harry gradually shifted as the emotional impact of his father's death and the circumstances of their final reconciliation became clearer. Polls showed increasing sympathy for his position and growing support for his eventual return to some form of royal duties. However, significant segments of the public remained skeptical about whether he could be trusted with official responsibilities after his previous departures and criticisms. The Royal Lodge itself underwent security upgrades following the breach, but it also became a symbol of both division and reconciliation within the royal family. Plans were announced to convert part of the property into a memorial to King Charles III, creating a lasting tribute to the monarch whose death had ultimately brought his fractured family together in their final moments. As the first anniversary of the Royal Lodge incident approached, the royal family had achieved a fragile peace that few had thought possible during those dramatic early morning hours when alarms pierced the silence of Windsor Great Park. The crisis that had threatened to destroy the monarchy's credibility had instead demonstrated its capacity for human redemption and the enduring power of family bonds, even under the most extraordinary circumstances. The story of Harry's desperate attempt to reach his dying father would be remembered as both a low point in modern royal history and a testament to the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation even in the most difficult family circumstances. It served as a reminder that beneath the protocols, traditions, and constitutional responsibilities of monarchy, there remained the fundamental human relationships that connected fathers to sons, brothers to brothers, and families to each other across even the most seemingly insurmountable divides.